Hey everybody, today we're going to be looking at one of the staples of audio production, the compressor. We're going to be looking specifically at some of the foundation points of what it is, how it works, and then we're going to look at some specific things with Logic's compressor. We're also going to explore some of the other compression tools that Logic has. And hopefully that through all of that, it'll show you some of what's possible, how to use them a little bit, and explain when and where maybe you shouldn't use them. What we have here is a typical compression diagram. This is on most of the digital compressors. You have your knee where the threshold crosses. You have all of the other information you need to know from this. When the level crosses over the threshold, the ratio tells how much it's going to be reducing your volume, and depending on whether it's a peak meter or an RMS meter, all this information is going to determine just how different it's going to be with an attack release, all this stuff going into what a compressor does. You know what? Hold that thought. I think instead of getting really complicated, I want to start a little bit more simple. Think of a compressor as a fader on an audio console. If you can't hear something, you turn it up. If it gets too loud, you turn it down, and then you turn it back up when it gets softer. That's what a compressor does. It's just automatically controlling the volume of one of your tracks. So that way, if it's too soft or too loud, you can control that without having to ride a fader the entire time. Simply put, that's what it is. Now, imagine you have a fader in a console, and instead of you have a robot doing it. And they have near instantaneous reaction time. And they can hear all the levels and very accurately determine what level something's at. So we have a robot running your faders. Pretty easy to understand. What we're going to do, though, is I want to go through some of these settings now in the context of that fader so you can see a little bit more about what is actually happening. So we have a few different samples loaded up here. We're going to start by adjusting a threshold. Now, as we're doing this, first thing you should know is that I've got the reaction times as short as possible. The attack time is turned all the way to the shortest amount, and the release is as short as it goes. That way we can really hear what's happening here. So as we move the threshold down, you'll see that it's going down, and more is being compressed. That's because more of the audio is below that ceiling. So we've lowered the ceiling, the sound is trying to punch through, it goes through, but it's less as it does that. So a threshold sets how much is really happening here, sets how much of the audio is being changed, how much of it's being put through this particular tool. Next we have the ratio, and that determines how much, once it goes through the ceiling, is being let through or not. How much is being changed on the other side of that threshold. We always do this in the form of a ratio, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 5-to-1. That means for every one of the 5 volume units that go above the threshold, if it's a 5-to-1, if 5 go above it, only 1 makes it through. So if 10 go above and it's a 5-to-1, then 2 of those decibels will make it through. Now, technically, it's how much is being changed above the threshold, but the sound, all of it goes through and none of it's actually being blocked. It just comes out a little different. Sometimes a little softer, and then we have to turn up the whole thing. Sometimes when you get done with this process, it's going to seem louder, and that's because we've made more room for it. So we have that ratio, and you can see that as we increase the ratio, those peaks and spikes get bigger. Now, with a max ratio, you can see it's almost a flat line. Nothing is getting through. So why then does it look like stuff is getting through if we have a brick wall ratio set there? Well, like I said before, everything always gets through. It's just a matter of what it looks like on the other side. So nothing gets through above that threshold. So that's as loud as anything could be. And anytime something falls below that, it's actually going to appear like that's much louder because that part, we've taken down all the peaks. The softer stuff now becomes of an equal or close to equal level. Everything seems louder in those softer parts. That's actually where some of the pumping happens. And we can use this to great effect to make a drum track, for instance, sound more exciting if we time this just right so that the softer spots get louder in a very musical way. So it's actually moving up and down, and the overall drums then begin to pump, and you get this really exciting final result. Next, we have that knee. The knees, I don't really adjust this very often, but what it does is that point where the threshold comes and hits, sometimes we can start to compress just a little bit early to smooth out as it goes into the greater compression time. So just adjusting that knee can smooth it out. Unless you're having real big issues with your default setting, you won't change that very much. Now, the attack time and the release time define, for the most part, what a compressor sounds like. Now, you may have heard that an attack time is what happens once it crosses the threshold, but in reality, the attack and release are kind of always working. Especially the release time is even when your sound is below the threshold or all of the time above the threshold, the release is going to adjust how the volume of your track is changed. So you'll hear some changes when that's happening, and it will change. I don't know if it's exactly how linear that response is, but in a way that's what it is. So some of the changes will continue to happen even when the rest of it's not being activated above or below the threshold, and you'll get a little different sound. Now, the quirks in the attack and the release are part of what give a compressor a sound. And many analog hardware compressors, they're really going to be different in those two aspects. And when you have a digital compressor, a lot of the character comes from how that works. So in Logic, we have an auto attack and release. It is affected by what we set for the attack and release, but it's going to change depending on the content that's being put through the compressor. So it gives it the Logic sound. And there's all the algorithms for the compressor in Logic, and each of those, among other things, have different types of attack and release. And so that really does give us some of that feed. Now, simply put, if we're doing a percussive sound like drums, we're going to let some of the original attack through so it doesn't dull or get rid of some of the excitement of the drums. So we have a little bit slower attack and a medium to quick release, so that way it gets back to normal. And you can see here we've got some of the release happening even heavily underneath or above the threshold, and it's doing the same thing at all the different parts with a super long release time. Now, to get a more natural sound, all of these factors play in together, and you do them in smaller amounts. So we don't pull the threshold all the way down into the drum sound. We don't have a really high ratio. We have a fairly quick but not too quick attack time. And we have a release that lets it go before the next hits happen. So that's one of the tricks too, is when you're setting the release time, set it so that it's going back to a normal release before the next hits are happening, so that the original compression part isn't affecting the next hits. So we adjust the release depending on the material. Last thing I want to say about this is that we have a mix button, so we can actually mix some of the compressed sound with the uncompressed sound. We could do this on an analog console using a mult, where you make a copy of one of the analog tracks and one of them goes out through a compressor and the other one doesn't, and then you mix them back together. You have a compressed version, which is doing a lot of that squashing of the sound, mixed in with the uncompressed version, the more natural with all the hits and the energy, and then the compressed one fills in and adds to the uncompressed one. You have a really nice sound. So that's one version of mixing things together. The thing I like about Logic is that it has the mix knob right on the compressor, so you don't have to do any other routing. You just adjust the mix, and you have some of the compressed mixed with some of the uncompressed, and you get a really, really good sound that fills it out. Okay, what I want to do next is go a little bit more into the software and show you 3 other examples of how we're going to use compressors, and by doing so, teach you some of the ways that compressors are used. Okay, so the three things I really want to talk about here are three things which will help you understand a little bit more about what a compressor does, how it works, but also give you some additional tools to use inside Logic. So first and foremost, we have what's called a side chain, and essentially every compressor, whether it's on a track and analyzing that track and then compressing it, or using a side chain, they're all having to analyze some material. In this case, what we're saying with the side chain is that we want to analyze something outside of the compressor and track. It will analyze all of the content there as it's coming through, but it will compress the destination track. So this is something we use a lot in various styles of music. In this case, what we're going to do, I've got this on drums. We'll see, I've got the drums here and this bass part. But you can hear the bass is having a little bit harder time coming through. So I actually want to change this a little bit. I want to change the drums, have it be compressed, but I wanted to do it using the bass part as the analysis. So every time the bass plays, the drums get compressed a little bit. A little extreme right this moment, but it's got the right idea. In fact, before I go on, I'm actually going to change this on the drums. I'm going to turn off that compressor. I'm going to add a separate compressor just so I can maintain my original settings. I want to keep the same algorithm though. Instrument, upright bass. And let's leave the compression on, the original compression. Now, you can hear the bass cutting through more because every time it plays, it's pulling down those drums a little bit.
Was a story from my youth, was a story that was truth, and I knew that it was here.
It's a great technique in tons of different styles. Okay, another dynamics-related compression technique we're going to look at is with the multipressor. Now we're going to do the multipressor because it essentially is the same thing as the compression we were just looking at, except the big difference being that we have 4 different bands of compressors. So each one of these is a compressor, except they're all split by frequencies. So I can compress the low frequencies separately than the high frequencies. And this is one of my favorite things about this tool. We can solo out the different ranges. So I might want to compress, say, the low frequencies to get them out of the way of the other things happening, but keep them still there. So we're going to put them a little bit. So really, this is the part of the sound I want to cut through more. So we're going to increase the ratio. And then boost the whole range.
Was a story from my youth, was a story that was truth, and I knew that it was here. I heard it once, it stayed for life. I knew that it would never leave. I knew that this was going to be my knife. In the end it haunted me, and in the end I haunted you, and in the time.
Cool. So now that part's cutting through just a little bit differently. It's almost like EQing it, but we're EQing it and compressing the band we're EQing simultaneously. Gives us a really cool effect that's really subtle, but it's powerful in the way that it cuts through everything. The last thing I want to show you is using compressors in series in order to get probably a better result than using one compressor at higher levels. So using multiple compressors at lesser levels. Let's pull open one of our other tracks here. We have this dobro here. And it has a compressor, but it's not being used. Let's put one of these on. And we're going to use just the Platinum Digital in addition to using just the default algorithm here. I'm going into the sidechain option. Sidechain, which we were talking about, is this input from the outside, but it's also just our own track as well. We're going to put this to peak instead of RMS. So peak means it's going to look at or analyze the incoming signal's actual peak level. If we did RMS, it would be more of the average level. So we're going to put it on peak. And we're going to do one set of compression that's a little bit less. Not too much. And then we're going to put a second one on here. Make the same change to the peak. Solo that, turn off the solo rather.
Was a story from my youth, was a story that was truth, and I knew that it was here. I heard it once, it stayed for life. I knew that it would never leave. I knew that this was going to be my knife. In the end it haunted me, and in the end I haunted you, and in the time it took to figure out its truth.
Okay, so I hope that you were able to really figure out and understand what we were talking about and see some of the benefits of using compressors. I hope you enjoyed this video, and that's it. We're going to do some more of these type of topics on other things coming up, but this is a wrap for the compressor video.